The evidence will show that someone who played make-believe with a real gun and violated the cardinal rules of firearm safety is the defendant, Alexander Baldwin.
And you will hear no evidence, not one word, that Alec Baldwin had anything to do with that real bullet being brought onto that set. You will hear no evidence whatsoever. No evidence that anything Mr. Baldwin did, that something he did in that moment, that horrible moment when she put that bullet in that gun, none of it had anything to do with Alec Baldwin.
A fiery start to the Alec Baldwin trial. All eyes are on New Mexico as a jury will have to determine whether Alec Baldwin is criminally responsible for the shooting death of cinematographer Halyna Hutchins. We break down the opening statements from the prosecution and defense in this new high-profile trial. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. The New Mexico criminal trial of Alec Baldwin has officially begun with opening statements. The A-list actor is facing an involuntary manslaughter charge for the 2021 shooting death of cinematographer Halyna Hutchins on the set of the movie Rust. This was when a prop gun that was held by Alec Baldwin went off. Turns out a live round was in that weapon, and the bullet hit Halyna, as well as director Joel Souza. He was hit in the shoulder. He survived. Halyna was hit in the chest. She tragically died. Now, the armorer in this case, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, was already convicted of her own involuntary manslaughter charge and sentenced to the maximum of 18 months in prison. She failed to load and check the gun properly that day. Well, Baldwin now faces potentially the same fate for his alleged role in this shooting. And normally I would summarize each side's position, but now we have each side laying it out in their opening statement. So you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from them. Now, their initial presentation was to this jury of 11 women, 5 men. It took only a day for the jury to be selected. So now we want to hear both narratives. And to be clear, opening statements are not evidence per se. They're merely a roadmap for the jury, a summary, a preview of what they can expect each side to present to them over the course of this trial. And we're going to start off with the prosecution. Here is Erlinda Johnson.
When someone plays make-believe with a real gun in a real-life workplace, and while playing make-believe with that gun violates the cardinal rules of firearm safety, people's lives are endangered, and someone could be killed. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what this case is about. And you will learn that some of the people who were hired to work at this workplace were very inexperienced. And one of those was the armorer, a very young woman named Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. You will hear testimony from crew members who worked on the set, who will tell you that to them, Ms. Gutierrez's inexperience was obvious. And on October 13th, 2021, the defendant was supposed to have a training session with this gun and this young armorer. But you will see that during this training session, the defendant had somebody or a couple of people filming him while he's running around shooting this gun. You will also see evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that during the days before that fateful October 21st day, the defendant handled this firearm multiple occasions. You will see video footage of the defendant firing this firearm, working perfectly fine. But you'll see evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that each time the defendant handled this firearm, he did not do a safety check with that inexperienced armorer. And you'll hear that the reason he didn't do a safety check is because he didn't want to offend her. The evidence you will see will paint a real-life picture of a real-life workplace where this defendant mishandled this gun. You will see him using this gun as a pointer to point at people, to point at things. You will see him cock the hammer when he's not supposed to cock the hammer. You will see him put his finger on the trigger when his finger's not supposed to be on the trigger. You will hear about numerous breaches of firearm safety with this defendant and this use of this firearm.
So a few things here. The prosecution is saying it's not just what Baldwin allegedly did on the day in question, which we'll get into, but it's also what they claim is a pattern of recklessness, that this wasn't an isolated event, but we have evidence to show how he was inappropriately and dangerously handling the weapon in the past. And they jumped out in front of the idea that Hannah Gutierrez-Reed was inexperienced, which again was brought up during her trial. But at the end of the day, it was Alec Baldwin who was the one that was acting erratically and wasn't paying attention properly during the training sessions, and he was the one who pulled the trigger. Now remember, there's something else here. The prosecution is going into this case reeling from a major legal loss. They can only argue so much about Baldwin's responsibility because the other day, the judge in this case, Mary Marlowe Sommer, said prosecutors can't introduce evidence of Baldwin as a producer on the film to show he is legally responsible for what happened. The judge said, I'm having real difficulty with the state's position that they want to show that as a producer, he didn't follow guidelines, and therefore as an actor, Mr. Baldwin did all these things wrong, resulting in the death of Halyna Hutchins, because as a producer, he allowed all this to happen. And that's a blow to the prosecution. There's no other way of saying it, because they were relying on presenting to the jury that Baldwin, as a producer on the film, he had an added layer of responsibility and knowledge about what was going on and control over what was happening on the set. But the judge explained that there were other producers on the film too. It wasn't just in Baldwin's hands, so he can't be proven to be responsible for all that was happening. He is going to be judged as an actor, not as a producer. Now, let's move on to the day of the shooting. This is the idea of him as a rogue agent.
And the evidence will show that Ms. Gutierrez then handed the gun to the defendant. And what you will learn is that once again, the defendant failed to do a gun check or a safety check with this armor. So he takes the firearm, puts it in his holster. Then Ms. Hutchins and Mr. Souza were doing this blocking. And the evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that the defendant again did his own thing. The evidence will show that on October 21st, 2021, after that lunch break, the defendant once again violated those set safety rules. And during this blocking, the director had instructed him to just slowly take out that gun and just hold it at an angle. But you will see that the defendant takes it out quickly the first time, points it. And you will hear witness testimony who will tell you the first time he does it, his finger is on or around the trigger.
That's the real issue. Did Alec Baldwin pull the trigger or not? That arguably could be the whole case. And remember when Alec Baldwin famously told ABC News' George Stephanopoulos that he didn't pull the trigger, that he would never point the gun at someone and pull the trigger, that he did not do that. But now we want to hear from Johnson on that point regarding the trigger.
The evidence will show that meanwhile, after the shooting, the defendant began to claim he didn't pull the trigger. The evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that's not possible. You will hear from Mr. Pieta himself, who will tell you that gun will not discharge without a pull of the trigger. You will hear from firearms experts who will tell you that gun will not discharge without a pull of that trigger. Bryce Ziegler, who is the firearms examiner for the FBI, will tell you that when he received this firearm, he first examined it. He didn't see any defects, didn't see any modifications. He tried and he checked the hammer in the 3 different positions, cocking positions. He checked the quarter cock position, fine. Checked the half cock position, fine. Checked the full cock position, fine. And when he held it in the full cock position, you will hear that hammer held until he pulled the trigger. And in fact, you'll hear evidence that the defendant himself admitted in December of 2021 that this gun didn't have any mechanical problems.
Hey everybody, I just want to take a quick second to thank Upside for sponsoring this episode of Sidebar. So Upside is a free app that gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas, groceries, dining. Now believe it or not, I do know how to pump my own gas. I don't know if that was controversial or not, but when I do, I can use the Upside app. Why not get cash back when you fill up your tank, right? And yes, this is actual, real cash back. No confusing rewards or points or credits, just actual money you can transfer straight to your bank account. So once you have the app, claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside. You pay as usual using a debit or credit card, and you follow the steps on the app and you get paid. And as you just saw me do, you can use Upside at places like, Shell, Exxon, Mobil, 7-Eleven, Sunoco, restaurants like Chipotle, Papa John's, Dairy Queen, Domino's, KFC, Taco Bell. That's just to name a few. Now to find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on screen and use our promo code SIDEBAR and get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. That's promo code SIDEBAR for an extra 25 cents back on your first gallon of gas. Now we did a previous Sidebar, what Baldwin told investigators that arguably showed how familiar he was with weapons on set and how experienced he was. And so this could weaken the defense's claim that the gun just went off. But here's the prosecution wrapping up their opening statement.
You are going to conclude and be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that on October 21st, 2021, that gun the defendant had asked to be assigned worked perfectly fine as it was designed, and that the fatal and one of the main problems that afternoon of October 21st was that the defendant didn't do a gun safety check with that inexperienced armorer. He pointed the gun at another human being, cocked the hammer, and pulled that trigger in reckless disregard for Ms. Hutchins' safety. And you will be convinced that the only true and just verdict in this case, so that true justice can be served, is a verdict of guilty to involuntary manslaughter.
Okay, and one final thing to note about the prosecution before we go over to the defense. It is my understanding that there are two theories by which the jury could find Alec Baldwin guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He either negligently handled the firearm, or he acted without due caution and circumspection in that he committed an act with total disregard or indifference for the safety of others, recklessness. Okay, so now we have the idea of what we're talking about with involuntary manslaughter and what the two theories are. With that, here is the defense's response to the prosecution. Here is defense attorney Alex Spiro.
On this set, there was a real bullet, something that should never be on a movie set, something which has nothing to do with making a movie. And you will hear no evidence, not one word, that Alec Baldwin had anything to do with that real bullet being brought onto that set. It is undisputed that the bullet was loaded into the gun by the armorer, the person on set whose responsibility it was to ensure the gun was safe. The first assistant director's job, the head of safety, Dave Halls, checks it before it goes to the actor. And he will tell you he made a tragic mistake. He failed to detect a live bullet. And Alec Baldwin had nothing to do with that either.
So the idea here, it wasn't Baldwin's responsibility for the live bullet to be in that gun, and it wasn't his responsibility how the gun was handled. That was not his job. He had no reason to suspect anything was off. It was the job of the armorer and Dave Halls, the assistant director who pled no contest to negligently handling the firearm, failing to inspect it properly. It's their responsibility, not Baldwin's. And you know what else Spiro argues? That you can't blame Alec Baldwin because he was in the middle of doing his job. He was in the acting zone.
The prop gun was placed in Mr. Baldwin's hands and cold gun was announced, meaning it had been checked and double-checked by those responsible to ensure the gun was safe. It was just a prop. They all thought it was just a prop and could do no harm. The actor's job is to act, to rehearse, to choreograph his moves, to memorize his lines. He's Harlan Rust. He's an outlaw running for his life, who in the incident in question, he's pulling a six-shooter to try to defend himself. That's why the gun has to be safe before it gets into the actor's hands. His mind is somewhere else, in the being of another, a century away, an outlaw. He must be able to take that weapon and use it as the person he's acting would. To wave it, to point it, to pull the trigger like actors do, in ways that would be lethal in the real world, but are not lethal on a movie set. You have to step back and remember what they were doing on a movie set. For acting to work, you have to be so close to the barrier of real and imagined that the viewer feels that they're there, that it's real. The viewer can't see strings from the stuntman. The stuntman must leap. The snake must hiss. And guns happen in movies. All over this country for many decades. Bang, bang. You've all seen it.
So again, he was focused. He was focused. You can't expect him to look at these other things that are happening. And by the way, actors, they have to use the gun in a way that looks real. So in other words, they're saying Alec Baldwin did nothing wrong here. And Spyro tries to show that by playing a clip from that scene in the church. This was before the shooting of Halyna.
And I'm going to show you that scene now before lunch. And if we could just play action.
I'm gonna go find some help.
I don't need no damn help.
You're gonna die if I don't.
He's wounded on the run. Play again. Continue.
Arlen Rust. Need you stand up nice and slow, tossing your weapons you have.
He's on the church pew, bleeding, his hand gripping the revolver. He would defend himself against the men in the movie. Play.
One more. You good? Ready? Arlen Rust. Did you get up nice and slow, tossing the weapons you have?
What else can I get right there?
Joel, you want me to wait to give you that line till he lands?
Okay.
Till camera lands?
Yeah.
Yep.
7 minutes, one.
Yeah.
Draw your gun and look up and point your gun, okay?
Okay, which way? Camera right or left?
This side, for now.
So camera left for now.
I'll stand right here for you, Alec.
So whip it out.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me get this all greased. Ready?
Yeah.
Okay, ready? Okay, ready? Ready.
And set. Ready, and action.
Arlen Rust.
Do one more just like that. You got one more? Yeah.
Ready, ready, ready,
They
ready.
want him to do it again. There's no danger. They want him to do it again.
And set. Ready, and action.
Arlen Rust. Nice.
And the idea here, no one was worried. If Baldwin was doing something out of step, no one noticed. No one said anything. And Spyro talks about, again, how Baldwin had no reason to believe that the gun was loaded with a live round or that it wasn't checked. He explains that it was announced cold gun, and he says cold guns can't hurt people. And after Dave Halls inspected it, Spyro says this is a guy, by the way, with decades of experience. Everyone can rest easy. Again, no one had any reason to suspect otherwise. Moving on from there, though, Spyro also focuses upon the prosecution's argument that Baldwin's statements are a problem about not pulling the trigger. And moreover, Spyro says, let's talk about the idea of pulling the trigger.
And so they told you about some of the things that Alex said in the statements that they will take or picked out a few lines from. But he won't tell you anything different, that he took a gun loaded and cleared by the armor and the AD. He made motions with the gun as he was rehearsing. He didn't intentionally pull the trigger. The gun just went off. And he does say, I didn't have a problem with the gun before. The SAG guidelines don't tell actors to check the gun. You will see them. That's not the actor's role. And so I guess the point that they're trying to make is that why in this specific moment he doesn't break his habit of 40 years and check it differently and sort of insult them this one time. You know, if he had done that and started playing with the gun in that way, they'd be saying, arrogant actor, why is he doing that? So they will play these statements, Alec's statements. You're going to hear a man in shock and grief. A father, an artist, worried about his family. You hear he's, on one of the calls, he's going to meet with the decedent's family, the Hutchins family, and he's upset about that. He will talk to law enforcement. He will call them. He doesn't need a lawyer. He didn't commit a crime. He will call them and offer to meet and speak over and over again. And ask anyone in the acting world. Actors know. Actors rely on armors and point guns and shoot guns. The Armorers Act, what they did, is clear and proven. The head of safety, you will learn, took responsibility for his verification failure. But Alec committed no homicide. On a movie set, you're allowed to pull the trigger. So even if he intentionally pulled the trigger like the prosecutor just demonstrated, that doesn't make him guilty of homicide. So rather than trying to answer the question of what happened, they proceed with the destructive test. They eliminate the one item that could prove what Alec said and believed. They didn't offer him a chance to test the gun. They didn't take the gun apart before they broke it and destroyed it and look at its inner workings. They didn't turn on their videotape. They just destroyed it. Can't ever be tested in the same condition it was in that day. Won't ever allow Alec to show his truth. And the destruction of this gun that you will hear in this evidence is symbolic of this entire case. Because the officers will tell you at that point, they weren't really investigating anymore. They were trying to disprove Alec, to get Alec, to have this day.
Not the actor's job to check the gun. And you know what? He's allowed to pull the trigger. That, my opinion, could get a little tricky because if the jury accepts that, then wouldn't they seemingly have to accept that he was pointing it at someone when he pulled the trigger? But I think the idea is clear nonetheless, that he's allowed to hold and use the weapon because this is a Western film. But really, my opinion, the main aspect, my view, one of the strongest pieces of evidence or arguments for the defense, the FBI destroyed the gun during their testing. How can we know for sure if the gun was capable of malfunctioning if you pull the hammer or you hold it a certain way, maybe some other way the gun could fire without pulling the trigger? How do we know that? Essentially the most important aspect of this case. How do we know it if the gun is destroyed? And that's a good point for the defense. Now to close it out, here's the defense wrapping up their opening statement.
He had been filming on that set for a handful of days. The evidence will show he had just gotten there. It's not as if he had been there for months and months and noticed things and failed things, and he had just gotten there. You don't notice every little thing when you start at a new place and when you're in the character of Harlan Rust. And so they will play the videotapes of Alec Baldwin, the actor, acting. They will show you perhaps over and over again him in shooting scenes. Bad Alec shooting a gun the wrong way in a movie scene. They will try to get you to picture that and forget that this was a movie set in the first place. That the reason they play those videos of him over and over is because they don't have any evidence of actual homicide. And you will learn the truth. Not a day goes by when we don't wish Alec had saved her life. So when they cry out justice, justice is truth. This was an unspeakable tragedy. Alec Baldwin committed no crime.
So once more, opening statements are not evidence, but they are a start of the trial, a preview of what to expect. Let's see if both the prosecution and defense will be able to show what they just told the jury over the course of this trial. We will continue to follow this trial for you in depth here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.